Imagine walking into a place you believe is safe, only to be treated like you don't belong. That's exactly what happened to Mrs. Johnson, a kind-hearted elderly woman just looking for a quiet stay at a hotel. She had traveled a long way to visit family, but the moment she stepped inside, she was met with hostility. The hotel manager, a man with an air of arrogance, barely looked at her before making it clear she wasn't welcome. With a cold stare, he dismissed her, speaking to her as if she were less than human. "We don't have any rooms for people like you," he muttered, his voice laced with condescension. Mrs. Johnson, taken aback, tried to explain she had a reservation, but he wouldn't listen. Instead, he ordered security to escort her out. She stood there, humiliated, hurt, and confused. But what this manager didn't know, what he never even considered, was who Mrs. Johnson really was. More importantly, he had no idea who her son was, because the very hotel he was running, it didn't belong to him. It belonged to her family. And the moment her son found out what had happened, everything was about to change. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. What happens next will shock you. Mrs. Johnson stood outside the hotel, the cold air biting at her skin, but the sting of humiliation hurt even more. She had never been treated like this before, not so openly, not with such blatant disrespect. She clutched her purse, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer disbelief of what had just happened. She had spent her entire life teaching her son about dignity, respect, and hard work. And now here she was, being tossed aside as if she were nothing. Meanwhile, inside the hotel, the manager smirked, feeling triumphant. He had dealt with situations like this before, always making it clear who was in charge. To him, Mrs. Johnson was just another guest who didn't fit his standards. He had no idea that his careless cruelty was about to cost him everything. As Mrs. Johnson walked away, she reached for her phone, her heart pounding. She didn't want to bother her son, but she had no choice. She dialed his number, her voice steady but firm. "Baby, I need you to come here. Now." On the other end, her son's expression darkened. He could hear something in her voice, something he hadn't heard in years. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys and headed straight for the hotel, unaware that what he was about to walk into would change everything. As Mrs. Johnson waited outside, memories flooded her mind. Memories of the sacrifices she had made to give her son a better life. She had worked tirelessly, believing that kindness and hard work would always win. But standing here now, in the cold, treated like she didn't matter, she wondered if that was really true. She wasn't just hurt for herself. She was hurt for every person who had ever been pushed aside like this, simply because of someone else's ignorance. Inside the hotel, the manager strutted around as if he owned the place. Employees stole nervous glances at him, whispering among themselves. A young receptionist, Lisa, had seen everything. She had wanted to speak up, but fear held her back. This wasn't the first time the manager had treated someone unfairly. She had watched him turn guests away before, making decisions based on his own twisted views, rather than company policy. But something about this time felt different. There was something in Mrs. Johnson's eyes, something that told Lisa this wasn't over. Meanwhile, down the road, Mrs. Johnson's son gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. He had spent years building his business from the ground up, making sure his hotel chain was known for excellence, for fairness, for treating guests like family. And now, his own mother had been humiliated in one of his hotels. He didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but one thing was clear: he was about to find out. Back at the hotel, Lisa took a deep breath and made a decision. She reached for her phone and sent a quick message to a coworker. Something's about to happen, and the manager has no idea what's coming. As the sleek black car pulled up in front of the hotel, Mrs. Johnson's son barely waited for the engine to stop before stepping out. His heart pounded, but his face was unreadable. Years of business had taught him how to mask his emotions. He wasn't just angry. He was disappointed, and that was far worse. Mrs. Johnson turned when she saw him, relief washing over her. But beneath that, there was something else, an unspoken pain, a quiet sadness that made his chest tighten. He gently took her hands. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but firm. Before she could respond, the hotel doors swung open. The manager, oblivious to who was standing in front of him, stormed out, shaking his head. "Ma'am, I thought I told you to leave. I won't ask again." His voice was sharp, dismissive, full of the same arrogance he always carried. Mrs. Johnson's son slowly turned, his eyes locking onto the man who had dared to disrespect his mother. The manager's smug expression wavered for just a second as he noticed the way people were suddenly watching, whispering. There was an energy in the air, something shifting, something he couldn't quite place. Inside, Lisa stood behind the front desk, holding her breath. She knew things were about to change, but she had no idea how fast. The employees exchanged glances, some stepping closer, sensing that the moment they had all been waiting for was finally here. Then, in a voice that was calm but carried undeniable authority, Mrs. Johnson's son asked the one question that sent a cold wave of fear through the manager. "Tell me," he said, staring straight into the man's eyes. "Do you know who owns this hotel?" The manager scoffed, rolling his eyes. "I don't have time for games," he snapped. "I run this hotel, and I decide who stays and who doesn't." His voice carried the same arrogance, but there was a slight hesitation now, a flicker of doubt creeping in as he noticed the way everyone had gone silent. Mrs. Johnson's son didn't blink. He pulled a keycard from his pocket, turning it over in his fingers before holding it up. It wasn't just any keycard. It was his asterisk keycard, the one given only to the owner. "You run this hotel," he repeated, his voice deadly calm. "That's interesting, because I own it." The words landed like a thunderclap. The color drained from the manager's face. He looked around, as if searching for someone to tell him this was a joke. But no one spoke. The employees watched, waiting. The guests in the lobby had stopped pretending not to listen. Mrs. Johnson's son took a step forward. "So tell me again," he said, his voice sharper now. "Who exactly were you kicking out of my hotel?" The manager stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. I didn't know." His voice was barely above a whisper now. Mrs. Johnson finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "You didn't care to know." Her son exhaled slowly, glancing around at the staff. "I've worked hard to build a place where everyone feels welcome," he said. "And you've done the opposite. That ends today." The manager opened his mouth, scrambling for words, for an excuse, but it was too late. Lisa, still standing behind the desk, straightened up, finally allowing herself to smile. The employees exchanged looks, ones of relief, of quiet justice. The hotel would be different now. But just as the manager turned, ready to slink away in disgrace, Mrs. Johnson's son spoke again. "One last thing," he said, pausing just long enough for the tension to return. "You see, I don't just own this hotel." He gave the manager a knowing look. "I own all of them." The manager froze. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just the end of his job, it was the end of everything. The manager stood frozen, his face drained of all arrogance. He had spent so much time believing he held power over others, but now the truth had shattered his illusion. He wasn't in control. He never was. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps heavy with the weight of his downfall. No one stopped him. No one spoke up for him. He had built his own fate, and now he had to live with it. Mrs. Johnson watched him go, then turned to her son with a small, proud smile. "I didn't want to bother you," she admitted softly. Her son shook his head. "You could never bother me, Ma," he said. "You built everything I have. No one disrespects you. Not in my hotel, not anywhere." Lisa and a few other employees stepped forward, relief clear on their faces. "Thank you," Lisa said quietly, "for standing up to him." Mrs. Johnson's son nodded. This place is about respect, and from now on, it's going to run that way. As Mrs. Johnson finally stepped inside, this time welcomed with warmth, the message was clear: dignity always wins, and those who abuse power will always lose it in the end.